welcome Father Cameron. Now, Father Cameron, you are the Rector of the Regional Seminary of Victoria and Tasmania, based here in Melbourne. You're a priest of the Archdiocese of Melbourne. You have a background in law, and then were ordained a priest and were sent for further studies to Rome and focused in your doctorate in particularly on the just war tradition, which I'd like to get to. But before we get there, I'd like to ask a bit about yourself, because you weren't raised Catholic, you became Catholic and then ultimately a priest and now the rector of a seminary. So maybe do you mind mapping that story for us?
In summary form, certainly. I grew up nothing in a sense, but in my later primary years I went to an Anglican school and found my Christian faith there, and was very influenced by a school chaplain there who asked me in grade 5, had I been baptised? And I didn't know, and I went and asked my parents and they said I hadn't at that point, and I said I would like to. And so I chose some godparents and I was baptised at the local Anglican church, where I also joined the choir, and I was there for the morning Eucharist and evensong as well every Sunday. So I had a great exposure, in a sense, to the Christian faith through that, and also to the riches of the Anglican patrimony and the great music and culture. And things went from there. I felt a call to the priesthood probably since I was 12, and that grew and grew. But then I got into university. I did law and I did arts as well, and it sort of went away a bit. Never entirely. It kept pecking, the call from God. But I became interested in Catholicism in my early 20s, and then that grew stronger and stronger, and I made the decision to become a Catholic. And the vocational call came back straight away, very strongly after that. And I was in the seminary within 2 years.
Wow. And that call came when you were working as a lawyer to join the seminary?
I was working in policy development in government in Canberra, actually. And my life was very busy, and I felt I was pushing God out. And so on the way to the office, I would pop into St Christopher's Cathedral, and I started attending daily Mass, and that was a wonderful, beautiful highlight of the day. And I thought, there's nothing wrong with this. I like it, and I became more interested in Catholicism that way.
Wonderful. Was it a particular person or a particular intellectual kind of move that helped you shift from, say, Anglicanism to Catholicism? How would you see that shift occur?
Through reading and the influence of others, but I would say particularly the inspiration of St John Henry Newman.
Okay.
Yes, and also some, at the time, Anglican priests, a couple of whom become Catholic since, were very inspirational in terms of their witness. And I sort of went first in terms of becoming Catholic, but they became Catholic later.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. There's one of my favourite quotes of St. John Henry Newman, which I think is adaptable to vocations. He says, persons influence us, voices melt us, looks subdue us, deeds inflame us. And I think that seems like there are a myriad of different influences, you could say, that shaped you from the beginning. God seems to have been guiding you throughout from your baptism in year 5, was it, to the age of 12 and through your whole vocational journey now?
I would say that's right, and I would say that in all the different influences that John Henry Newman mentions, that God was at work.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. No, thank you very much for sharing that. And maybe if we move to your doctorate, which is focused on the just war tradition, how did you get interested in, and how did that occur?
That's interesting. Firstly, I was asked to do a doctorate in moral theology, which I had been studying. And as you would know, doctorates have to contribute something original. They are meant to contribute to the sum total of human knowledge, which can be quite difficult sometimes. So doctorates are normally fairly obscure in their focus. They're narrow and deep. And so I've always been interested, I think through my study of political science, in government and the use of authority, but also how the church interrelates with that. And so St. Augustine has always been very involved in that, but there's been an awful lot written on St. Augustine and just war. So I wanted to take a different approach, and so a theologian was suggested to me by the name of Paul Ramsey, who was a Methodist ethicist in the mid-20th century, a real trailblazer in some ways. And he'd written 3 books on just war. And he'd mentioned Augustine quite a bit, but he used the texts and sources of St. Augustine in a very different way to that which is traditional. So I became more and more interested in that, and that topic was approved, and I went from there.
Yeah, wonderful, fascinating. Now, the issue of just war, it's kind of a, suppose you could say it's a controversial term within and without the church, but it seems like it's a central theme today within the context of the world. Could you maybe map out the biblical basis or the shift? What is the church's teaching on just war? Because, I mean, my first kind of response is, well, I didn't know that the church would have a just war tradition. I thought the church was pacifist. How do we kind of grapple with it from within the context of the church and the church's teaching?
You're right to say that the description just war is controversial. People say to me, well, how can any war be just? And in a sense, I agree with them, because there's always injustice in war, always violence, always harm, particularly to the innocent, which is a great problem with it. But I think a better term than just war is justified war or justifiable war. There are wars in the Old Testament, and there's invocations to war and violence. Not so much, I would say, at all in the New Testament. But at the same time, when we look at the words of Jesus, they're quite mixed on the topic. He doesn't really talk about war specifically, but he talks about peace, and he talks about the use of violence. He says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall inherit the earth." He talks also about turn the other cheek if someone does something bad to you. And for instance, in Gethsemane, the servant of the high priest has his ear cut off with a sword by one of Jesus' companions, and he says, "Put your sword away." He said, "Those who live by the sword die by the sword." A very famous quote. So in a sense, we think from that Jesus is saying he wants everybody to be peaceful, but then he also says to render unto Caesar, to respect the authority of proper governments. And he also says, "I have come not to bring peace, but a sword," which seems to contradict those other things he's saying about swords. He himself makes cords into a whip in the temple and uses violence. So while Jesus is the Prince of Peace, his own words on these things are somewhat mixed. We also have, of course, the 5th commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." Very sadly, war does involve killing. And I think St. Augustine is the one that tries to put that into some context. He's what we would call a Christian realist, or there's a school of thought, Augustinian realism, in which he highlights our fallen nature, that we're created good, and he wants the world to be good and peaceful, but that the bad guys will always exist. And as long as they do, he says that people have a right to self-defense and to protect themselves particularly. But he goes a lot further than that.
Interesting. So one way that I've conceptualized it, correct me if I'm wrong, is, violence or, war can be justified to the extent that it brings about peace, that war can only ever be a means to an end. Would that be a correct frame to kind of to use with regard to these?
Certainly, and Augustine himself does say that. His writings in this area are very varied. They're letters to Roman consuls, to governors, they're scraps from homilies and so forth. They were put together a bit later on by St. Thomas Aquinas and some priests, lecturers at the Salamanca University in the 1600s, which has now been really incorporated into international law.
From those kind of different comments scripturally, and even Augustine, what you just mentioned, it seems kind of a mixed bag in terms of knowing basic principles. When I mean, you mentioned Thomas Aquinas at the Salamanca School, when these principles came together, what are some of those principles that are used today that the church has kind of developed and concretized for us today that to judge certain wars?
Certainly. I mean, these principles are to do with a decision to enter a war, and then there's principles to do with how a war should be fought justly, in a sense. And then also there's some newer principles about what has to happen after the war. With regard to entering a war, that has to be declared by legitimate authority, so probably recognised by the United Nations, a state, even though all the time the United Nations would be trying to prevent that war. And war must be a last resort. So all the avenues of dialogue should have been exhausted before there is any use of force. That's not to say that that has to go on forever and ever as a tactic by an enemy, just to prevent the use of authority. So those would be a couple of, in terms of justifying a war. There has to be a right intention. There has to be a just reason for going to war. But if we look at war itself, there's really only two principles. One is the protection of the innocent, non-combatants. So there's plenty of examples where that hasn't been the case. But the intention must be always to put out of action those who are using the force to create peace in the end. But unfortunately, I think the figures are in the Second World War, 45% of those who were harmed were non-combatants. And in Vietnam War, I think it was up to 65%. So that's one, non-combatant immunity, we call it, or discrimination, discriminating against targets, which you cannot do with an atom bomb or we say carpet bombing, total war, that's called. It's just total annihilation of a country. But, and the other, that speaks to the other element, which is proportionality, that the weapons used should only ever be directed in a way that can protect the non-combatants. So that makes atomic weapons very difficult to use in a way that can achieve that end. And Pope Francis in 2020, in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, he doesn't condemn the just war principles, but he says that very often they're misused by people seeking to use them as a way to use violence and enter into a war. And he also says with the sheer force of warfare today, particularly atomic weapons, it's very hard to justify the use of those principles.
So, and one of the other principles and characters at play that you looked at in your doctorate, Paul Ramsey, I was rereading your introduction to your doctorate this morning, and quite strikingly, he adapts some of those principles that you've mentioned, but there's a bit of a, I think you call it a two-phase shift in his thought from discriminating non-combatants, but also the centrality of agape, of love, of self-sacrificial love as an important prism through which to look at war. Could you maybe expound upon that, what agape means more generally and meant for Paul Ramsey within this context?
All right, sure. He went on a sort of journey of discovery with regard to this. He began as a pacifist, and it was the bombing of Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941 that really changed his thinking on this. He thought, why can't America have a right to defend itself? And he went from thinking that agape, which is sort of, in a sense, lying down and accepting what comes passively, at the same time, he then decided that the use of force and self-defense by America against an enemy, which I think he regarded as quite evil in Nazism and other parties, he just decided that the use of force was justifiable, and that was the most loving form of action. He gives the example also of the Good Samaritan, that wonderful parable that Jesus tells in the Gospel, and he says, well, what if whilst the Good Samaritan was being attacked, there was a bystander? He said, should the bystander stand by and say, we can't use violence? He says, no. He says, their duty, as St. Augustine says as well, is to fend off the attacker if they feel confidently able to do so. So in that context, that is the most loving action. he says that these matters are determined by the context in which they're used.
Yeah, fascinating, wonderful. And you've kind of hinted at some historical examples. I know you have a love of history. Could you maybe comment a bit more broadly on maybe a particular war that you could judge with some of these principles as an example?
Certainly. I mean, if we look at the Great Wars, it takes quite a long time to even work out how the First World War began. I mean, obviously there was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand that was the spark that lit the fire, but that became very complicated. But if you look at the Second World War, if you look at something like Nazism, I think today would be regarded as pure evil, and the Allies in that sense were responding to that. I think that's a good example of that. The way in which they conducted that war would not always be in terms of Catholic social reasoning right, but I think we could say that in many ways that was a battle between good and evil.
Mm. Yeah, and what about some of the events within the war? One of the we were talking earlier between Coventry and Dresden. There was a bombing of city for city. What was the situation there? Can you give a bit of background there?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think particularly with Dresden, we could describe that, I think, as Churchill himself did, as total war, and that total obliteration of Dresden. Okay, not simply the targeting of military installations, but carpet bombing, which was meant to destroy the morale of the community. Okay, we could also look more broadly, I think, at the dropping of the atom bomb on Hiroshima on the 6th of August, 1945, and Nagasaki on the 9th of August. They, in a sense, put an end to World War II only just a few days later because they were such dramatic actions. But as Catholics, we always say that the end never justifies the means, and that every moral act must be valued in itself because they always have consequences.
Yes, yeah, fascinating, wonderful. And looking forward historically, I think it seems like a tradition that needs to adapt more and more with developments in technological warfare, and which gives more complicated kind of responses with I suppose drone-like warfare, and the question of responsibility and obligation, who's responsible for what, and so forth. Are there any developments in Catholic social teaching with regard to just war that you've kind of come across in adapting to some of these more complex situations?
I would say at this point in time, moral theologians analysing them, the Church is always calling for peace first and foremost, which is very important. But with regard to some of the technical matters involved, I think they're under discussion still and really being grappled with as to what can be justified. I mean, if you look, you mentioned drones and asymmetrical warfare and things like this. Unfortunately, in many ways, technology always, in a sense, moves ahead before morality and moral analysis. And warfare, in many ways, sadly, is the art of the possible. What can be done, in a sense, awfully, what can be got away with in many circumstances. And so I would predict in the coming years, you'll have more to say, you'll hear more from the official church, but also from theologians. Probably, if I may say, the main area of development has been in what we might call the post-jus bellum in Latin, justice after a war, and a focus on once peace has been achieved, the moral need to rebuild countries that have been destroyed. A great example of this is the Marshall Plan that occurred after World War II, which just Europe, in terms of all parties, was basically destroyed, and that huge amounts of money in infrastructure there, but also in Japan as well after World War II, were used to really try to to rebuild, but also to focus on human rights and to re-establish democracy.
And how did that unfold? Because that was the Yalta conference, was that correct? That the heads of the different nations of the Allies got together. Was that No, that was end of World War One. Was it the Yalta?
Yalta was towards the end of World War II.
It was too, yes.
But
was that part of that reshaping of the future of Europe?
Yalta actually was more to do with the agreement between the big three, as they were called, so Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt, and that was really about deciding that the Allies would only accept unconditional surrender.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's all relevant. But they met in Potsdam after World War II to work out how things would play out at the end of the war. The war still hadn't finished, actually, because Japan was still in the war. But I think more so the goodwill, in a sense, of President Harry Truman, who as well made the decision to drop the atomic bomb. But the goodwill, I think, after World War I, where the Versailles Treaty sort of concluded things by 1919, it was regarded that the terms of that were so harsh that in some manner, some would argue it led to World War II by the rise of Hitler, who was railing always against the Treaty of Versailles. But also life in Germany was very difficult with hyperinflation and various other things. So Truman I think thought, we don't want this happening again. And there has to be, in a sense, peace on just terms, which means that a lot of money needs to be spent and a lot of manpower needs to be used to rebuild Europe so that war will not occur again. And the same happened with General MacArthur in Japan. And I just was in Japan recently and just very impressed with it in many ways as a peaceful and well-functioning democracy.
And that was a fruit of General MacArthur's, to a certain extent, kind of impact there after the war?
I'd say very much. Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, changing lanes a bit, still within the context of Catholic social teaching, you've just come back from a sabbatical, kind of responding to Pope Leo's exhortation to study and reflect upon AI and its impact. And I think there's something... it's not insignificant that the Pope took the name Leo in light of his Leo the 13th, he's Leo the 14th. Leo the 13th was within a particular context of the Industrial Revolution, responding to that. And I think there is something analogous in the context that Leo the 14th has been chosen. As a general kind of comment, what fruits did you reap, I suppose, from your research into AI?
It was a very interesting time. It was a very graced time in a sense. I think I just said to you that moral theology is always catching up with new developments. In a certain sense, the Church catches up as well. The Church, in a sense, catches up in its own time, reflecting in our own times on the deeper aspects of these issues, particularly, I think, fundamentally how they affect the dignity of the human person. And that's really at the heart of what Pope Leo XIV has had to say about AI, just as it was in terms of Pope Leo XIII talking about the dignity of the human person after the Industrial Revolution, their right to own private property, their right to be in a trade union, and the proper role of government. In a sense, we're dealing with the same thing now, but it's moving at a much faster pace. To the cardinals in the Sistine Chapel who had just elected Robert Prevost the Pope, the day after he was elected, Pope Leo spoke of AI very significantly as some of his first words as Pope. I respectfully say I don't think that Pope Francis knew how to use a computer, which is fine, but Pope Leo is right onto this. It's, I think, very instructive that not only taking the name of Leo, but that Cardinal Robert Prevost, the day after he was elected as Leo XIV in the Sistine Chapel, said to the cardinals who just elected him that he took this name because Leo XIII was grappling with a whole lot of issues as Pope that he himself, I think, would be grappling with as the new Pope in terms of AI. If we look at the Leo XIII, and particularly his groundbreaking encyclical Rerum Novarum, he was very focused on the dignity of every person. And so he looked at the massive changes wrought, as you've said, by the Industrial Revolution. He looked at things like the right for an individual and a family to own private property, to in a sense, make fruitful what they have toiled for, but also looked at the role of trade unions, the dignity of the worker, and also the proper role of government contained in that. But I think, in a sense, Pope Leo XIV is looking at very similar issues to do with human dignity. In a sense, the rights of workers. We've seen mass sackings across many companies as their workforce is being replaced by technology. That's not new. I mean, Leo XIII writes of that in Rerum Novarum, with people's jobs being taken over by machines. In a sense, moral theology has to catch up with that. This will always continue to happen with technology. And in a sense, new jobs are found within the market, but that does take time. We don't know what those jobs will be. And in the meantime, there can be great social dislocation experienced by people. But also, I think another area that I particularly focused on, particularly as someone involved in seminaries and as a university lecturer involved in education, is just the role of education in teaching us to think critically, teaching us to write well. And if we use AI to replace these things, unfortunately, I think it means it will end up with a generation of people, or several generations, that can't think properly and can't write well either, which I think is a great concern in terms of our own human dignity and ability to use those gifts that God has given us, like intellect and creativity.
It's one of the things I've certainly struggled with AI as well. Often I see it as an externalization of responsibility, and it can encourage laziness, I find, which is something to be like we have to temper its use, I think. So would you say that Leo XIV, he's not all out saying don't use it, never use it, nor is he saying gun-ho? There's a measured approach, would you say?
Yes, I mean, in this sense, I don't think I can speak on his behalf, but I think to synthesize some of the things he's been saying, I don't think he says technology is a bad thing, and in a sense, living standards around the world have increased due to technology. But he's spoken of, in a sense, if this is a new technology like the internet was in the mainstream in the 1990s, he's saying everybody needs to have access to that technology and to reap its benefits. It's a mixed blessing. In a sense, unfortunately, it's like nuclear weapons, only in the sense they cannot be disinvented. Yes. I mean, wouldn't we love a world without nuclear weapons? Okay, AI is here to stay. We have to grapple with its consequences. Governments, in a sense, need to regulate it, but they too are catching up with the developments that are happening. We see various stories to do with things that are very socially concerning, with the use of AI, vulnerable people seeking advice from AI rather than trusted professionals, and in some cases some very sad and drastic consequences because of that. The AI companies themselves are aware of that. After the event, because not everything is predictable, they try to come up with safeguards, but I think in the main the concern is with the race for the best AI, and I do think that's concerning in a sense. I'm not always sure that the development of AI is driven by how can we create a better world, but certainly there's a great profit motive involved as well.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the problems, like that race for the AI. What is the motive? And similarly, you contrasted it, say, with the nuclear bombs. Like, well, now we're stuck with them. But I suppose asking the question of, well, what brought us to a world with this? Is an important question to ask, I think, because not all developments are obviously good. And so I suppose my question is, how do we nip it in the bud before it becomes problematic and we're stuck with it? Or is the response, this is the world we're given in. God is still calling us to follow him each and every day, regardless of the context. But I suppose my question is, how do we shape the context?
I think we need to embrace the good and limit the harm.
Yeah, perfect.
I think that's, in a sense, the same with all developments in the world. I would categorize AI as being a very good research assistant. From an academic perspective, look, if I type in write me a homily for Good Shepherd Sunday in Easter for 2026, AI will come up with something really based upon other homilies and scriptural things that it finds on the internet, quite incredibly the way it blends them together. It'll come up with something that's quite coherent, that gives scriptural references, gives an analysis of them, and something of a message as how I could apply that to my own life. So I could read that out in front of a congregation, but in the little experiments I've done with this, what it comes up with is very bland, because a homily should be really the fruit of a priest's prayer and reflection, pouring one's spiritual life out to a congregation. And AI can't do that. Okay. In some ways, I think it's less artificial intelligence as artificial information. It is, in a sense, with incredible deftness, often bringing together various sources on the internet. I use it, I think, as a research assistant, which is the way I described it, which gives a lot of other very useful sources which I can apply my brain and my creativity to come up with what I need. My concern, as I expressed, is that if we don't do that and we just use it, we come up with things that are very bland and, in a sense, people who are not upholding their own dignity by using their intellect and creativity that God has given them.
Yes, that's a beautiful way of putting it. I think like the way you said it quite beautifully. I think we give too much credit to it than it deserves, and it's not intelligent. It's simply information. But I think, as you were speaking, I was reminded of Eliot's comment: "Where's the wisdom? We've lost the knowledge. Where's the knowledge? We've lost the information." And I think we have, reduced ourselves, really, our own capacities to just information kind of generating and consuming machines. Basically, we've lost the capacity for the power of creativity to use our intellect and our heart, and therefore I think goes back to your other comment about the centrality of human dignity, that it is about people. And to the extent that we reduce ourselves, I think AI is a threat, because it does information better than we can, in terms of data production, analysis, and so forth. So no, that's really quite fascinating. So, and what's your kind of prediction going to the future? I mean, you've commented some kind of fears that you have that with AI, particularly in education and so forth. What are your some hopes going forward?
That AI is used for the benefit of all humanity. Firstly, that its benefits are shared. But secondly, from a scientific perspective, I think it can do great good in the medical and scientific worlds in terms of its analysis of data. But I just was speaking to a doctor yesterday about this, a specialist, and he said, that's correct. He said, but we need both. He said, we still need the human eye to run over the data analysis to pick up mistakes, and AI does make errors. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, that AI run over the human eye as well, because humans make errors as well, as we well know. So I think they can work hand in hand for the betterment of humanity. But, I did express some earlier concerns. Government needs to be, I think, very involved, particularly as far as I think what chatbots are called, where particularly vulnerable teenagers, children to some extent, but also vulnerable adults, seek to get advice to help them in their lives from machines, which in a sense can't read into our soul and don't offer the same kind of prudence that human wisdom can.
Yes, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Maybe a final question, if you don't mind. So you're the rector of a seminary, so you're responsible for the formation of candidates for the priesthood. I've been recently appointed vocations director in my diocese, and so I'm grappling with some of these questions about vocation and the priesthood. And recently we celebrated Good Shepherd Sunday, which there's a particular focus on vocations to the priesthood. What tips is for lack of a better word, what tips can you give to someone discerning the priesthood, and even what do you focus on as a rector in forming students to become priests in the world today?
Certainly. I'd say my focus on our seminary as rector is to make it a happy and peaceful place where young men can discern a vocation to the priesthood. I always say to them, there's no shame in leaving. There's no time here that is wasted. There's a good spiritual formation in terms of prayer life. There's a wonderful philosophical and theological education as well. There's no shame in leaving, but each of them comes from a very different background. Some come from families that practice the faith very actively, others from families that in a sense have none, but they have still felt the hand of God drawing them. God works in very mysterious ways, as we know, and each man's story is very different. So in a sense, I interview them before they come to the seminary and give some advice with regard to that. But my role is much more of a hands-on role in the seminary itself. In many ways, I think the rector can be described as a wise predecessor of mine did. The rector is the parish priest of the seminary. So first and foremost, I have a pastoral responsibility for each and every seminarian that is there. But at the same time, I have responsibilities with regard to the smooth running of something that is an institution in some ways, no matter how much we may want it to feel like a home as well.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. And what are your future projects? So you're currently working on this AI, the fruit of your sabbatical. You're working on a paper, is that correct?
Yes, I'll be presenting at a conference on these issues soon. As normally happens with academia, that will hopefully turn into an article which is published. That will be more to do with this idea of the inherent dignity of every person and how we can responsibly use AI as individuals in a way that is fruitful and that doesn't restrict our ability to develop ourselves.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you, Father Cameron, for coming on today. Is there any place that we can follow you? Do you write things, or what's the best way to, as the rector of the seminary?
It's funny to say, I don't think I'm antiquated in the sense that I don't use social media. We use the seminary's social media, the seminary's Facebook. There's a page on the University of Divinity which talks about my research interests, but generally they're in published articles. Also, my doctorate to do with just war was turned into book form. I believe that's available on Amazon, no matter how obscure.
And what's the title of it?
I'll have to remember that because it's so
obscure.
It's the Augustinian Foundations of the Thought of Paul Ramsey.
The Augustinian Foundations of the Thought of Paul Ramsey
on just war.
On just war,
yes.
And we can buy that on Amazon.
I think so.
Amazon.
Yeah.
You haven't bought it recently.
Well, there was a print run of a few hundred copies, and I was given a good number myself to give away to friends. And you may have a copy, I feel.
Yes.
But I think it's available. It's also available from. It was published by the Lateran University in Rome. It's probably available from their bookshop, I think. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Unfortunately, I can't say it's available at all good booksellers.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thanks again, Father Cameron, and yeah, God bless you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Father Alex. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Thank you. So we're currently sitting in front of the Grand Cathedral of Melbourne, St. Patrick's Cathedral. Would you be able to share a bit about the structure of it, maybe the history and the architect and so forth, Father Cameron?
Certainly. St. Patrick's Cathedral is a building that's very close to my heart, not only for its sheer beauty, but it's the mother church of the Archdiocese of Melbourne. But also, directly underneath that grand spire, I prostrated myself while the Litany of Saints was sung for my priestly ordination. So whenever I look at that spire, I think of that very humbling moment and that privilege. It's a very beautiful building, both inside and out, designed by William Wardell, a very famous, was an English architect who migrated to Australia. I think it was in the 1850s, responsible for many grand buildings in Melbourne, including a government house, also St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney. This cathedral was built really with the pennies, as they were, of the Irish congregation who came along, built in a neo-Gothic style. William Wardell was a pupil of Augustus Werribee Pugin, who was responsible for much of the design of the Houses of Parliament in London. And he was a convert to Catholicism, as was William Wardell. So there's a lovely strand there as well. But both of them really thought that the neo-Gothic style could speak very beautifully to our hearts, portraying the love of God and his desire for us. We talk about the true, the beautiful, and the good, and I think all of them come together in the wonderful design of the cathedral.
Beautiful. And is it bluestone? Is that correct? Bluestone?
I believe it's bluestone. So many cathedrals at the time were built in sandstone, but bluestone, I think, was the common stone, particularly used from the Grampians, I believe.
From the Grampians, okay.
I think so. You need to check on that. But it's very unusual. It gives the cathedral quite a dark feeling inside, but at the same time in the afternoon with that golden stained glass, rather than the detail which we see in the rose window, which is very beautiful, it's a plain gold style glass, which just brings across wonderful shafts of light in the afternoon. Beautiful. I think that's probably its most famous aspect, actually.
Is the gold light
piercing
through?
Yes.
What time of the day is?
Mid-afternoon.
Mid-afternoon. Yeah.
And the spires, of course, the cathedral was built slowly and in several stages. The spires were not added until 1939.
1939.
Just before Australia was involved in World War II.
And what was the motivation for the spires?
Part of the original design.
Okay.
They're part of the original design by William Wardell. I believe the main spire was made higher than the original design. If you look at it, it seems somewhat sharpened or elongated. I understand from reading a history of the church that William Wardell's family were not happy that his design was in a sense changed, that the main spire at least was higher. That was done because if you look up Bourke Street in Melbourne, these spires can be seen behind Parliament House. The original design of Parliament House had a dome over it, which has never been built. And I understand that Archbishop Mannix at the time wanted that main spire of St Patrick's to be still seen from Bourke Street, even if that dome was built.
So he elongated it.
He did, and here we are, and the dome still hasn't been built.
Yes, marvelous. Thank you very much. That's very nice. Yeah. That's very good.
Some might be totally accurate.
No, that's it. Yeah, but I have heard that.